So kicking off this Create Salon on creative industries then and now is Weixuan Li of the Huygens Institute for Dutch History and the University of Amsterdam, who will talk to us about mapping 17th century art market in Amsterdam, space and strategy. Weixuan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Julia. Let me share my screen first. Yeah, can you all see my screen? The presentation?
Perfect.
Slides? Okay, great. So my presentation today, as Julia has already introduced, is about art, space, and strategy. So my presentation is, this research is stemming from my dissertation project, which is part of the larger NVO project, Virtual Interiors. And my research lies in the 2D mapping segment of this project, with the focus on the deep mapping art market in 17th century Amsterdam. Speaking of the 17th century art market, it is well known that it is composed of a largely cluster of painters catering to the demand of expanding base of client. But it remains unclear, however, such a complex multi-layered painting industry took place in space and how such painter strategies fitted in and eventually changed the spatial development of the art market. And different from many socioeconomic studies on this topic already that focus mostly on the citywide overview, my approach operationalizes the deep mapping concept and applies a temporal spatial perspective to the art market research. And the advantage of this approach is threefold. First, in a given moment, it provides a scalable platform for which we can look closely at any single painter behavior without losing the context. And second, it enables a temporal dimension too, which can trace the sequence of behaviors conducted by the painters. And lastly, the social relations embedded in the deep maps will help discern the similar or different choices made by painters of similar styles and background. Covering a very broad time span over 100 years in this short presentation, I will apply a relatively broad brushstrokes, cherry-picking snippets of stories from each stage, which will be fully elaborated in my upcoming dissertation. And to trace this remarkable journey, we have to go back to where it all started. And that is the late 16th century, when Amsterdam was still a small town and an artistic backwater. And before 1600, the traditional long-standing model of patronage was still in its full swing. And it was also the only one that is somehow in some sort of swing. The Femander, in his Schilder book of 1604, mentioned more patrons and art lovers living in Amsterdam, as we can see from this map. In Amsterdam, then it was mentioned for the painters who were active in the same city. And these patrons, as well as their deep pockets, were definitely the target for every painter to win. And in this nascent market for art, reputation was the key. And a word of mouth marketing requires being known, or at least being visible to your potential client. And therefore, moving into where the patron lives is favored by several artists. And Peter Peterson was certainly one of the followers of this strategy. Moving from Kalverstraat to the place near the Oudkerk, this convenient location near the Oudkerk offered him an easy avenue to wealthy patrons who, as we see in the paintings, supported the painter's career as a portraitist. In the next decades to follow, Amsterdam opened its door to immigrants, mainly from the southern Netherlands. Among them were many established masters. In their new home, these artists quickly formed small clusters by origin and expertise. a group of immigrant painters that sensed the absence of an open market for painting as they had in Antwerp. So they immediately drop their brushes and pick up the trade. This business savvy group turned out to be very well connected, and both socially and also in space. And they packed into the busy and bustling Coverstraat. It's a street that connected between a livestock market and some inland ports, and on the other end is the Dam Square. And this choice of location had proved to be timeless. One of the early settlers, like the Geertgieter family, had their family shop running for over 100 years, all the way into the 18th century. And meanwhile, the immigrant masters who held their paintbrush dear to their heart chose a different location. And this group of painters, mostly related to Hans Boll, specialized in landscapes from the south, a new genre which was well received in Amsterdam. And other than introducing this new genre, this group and their location choices pushed the artistic landscape eastwards and paved the way for the rise of the artistic center, the St. Antonio Breestraat. And in the following 3 decades, the landscape of art market expanded together with the city itself. But the St. Antonio Breestraat, as I highlighted here, this is 2 dark blue frame. These 2 streets, the St. Antonio Breestraat and Jardin Breestraat, resembled more artists than anywhere else in the city. And many famed and brilliant painters lived on this main wide street, as is suggested by the name Breestraat. And the others, whose works that we do not know, were swarmed in the side street, like closer to the market. And in the first 3 decades marked undoubtedly the golden age for art in the St. Antonio Breestraat neighborhood, and never before and ever after has such an area resembled such a great majority of the city's best painters. And never before were the most brilliant painters in Amsterdam so closely connected, both spatially and socially, as is shown in the network on the right. Painters certainly profited from the close connections among themselves, but the most enterprising and opportunistic ones, like Jan van Nagel and Adriaan van Nieuwland, who grew up in Amsterdam, knew how important it was to cultivate relationships with their wealthy and powerful clients among them. By 1631, when the wealth tax was collected, we see these 2 close friends had parted their ways, both in the location choices and in their career path. Van Nagel had moved to the privileged Herengracht as a substitute magistrate, serving public duties, and Van Nieuwland deployed an army of contacts in the art trade, like auctions, from the busy Coverstraat, like here. And judging by the tax they paid, they had cashed in their social relations very well and they did very well financially compared to the other painters of their time. But for outsiders, such a careful cultivation of relationships was much more difficult than for the locals. And it has to be done in a very different way. And location was certainly important in this regard. And we see, for example, Van de Valkert, who moved to Amsterdam as an established painter from The Hague, settled in the end of the Jardin Breestraat, in the outskirts of the artistic center. And in order to boost his reputation and to become more visible to his potential clients, he took the advantage of the Festival of Painters Guild in 1618 to host a party at his own house. And at the party, he circulated a printed sheet with a laudatory poem praising St. Luke as the patron of painters, perhaps to hint and allure his future patrons about the promised glory and praise they would receive if they would to serve as a patron for Van de Velkert. And we do not know for sure whether it was the party or the poem or his painting skills that managed to cast the spell. But we do see that prestigious and perhaps lucrative commissions flew into the artist's workshop in the coming years, and he putting himself amongst his patrons. But they were still before 1630, when the walls in both private residence and public institutions were not yet filled with paintings, and when the top-tier painters produced largely interchangeable products of the highest quality. In this time, social relations, reputations, and perhaps even their availability guided the patrons to their studios. And in other words, patrons and buyers came to seek the painters. And this is perhaps most evident if we visualize the sitters of portraits in the city. Van Velkert, like other fashionable portrait painters, had climbed all over the city while living by the end of Jodun Breestraat. In some sense, the painters in this period had this wind at their back. But in the same time, this distribution of portrait painters in 1631, reviewed from the text registry, shows that the newly developed grand canals like Herengracht and the Keizergracht were already where the most affluent client came from. And indeed, if we see the map of wealth distribution reflected in the text registry of 1631, the Cohere 1631, the same two canals had already become the new hub of wealth. And it was the painter of the lower rank, actually, who sensed this new reality and reacted to it promptly by locating in the radial streets, piercing through the grand canals for their painting shop. But in the next 2 decades, more artists followed their footsteps and moving closer to the rich neighborhood, to the west area that is now we call Jardin, especially around the Rozengracht and Lauriergracht. And this period also witnessed a steep growth in the population of painters, and the walls of Amsterdam houses and public buildings were more filled than ever before, and the table had been turned. So with so many world-class painters in the city, and even within the same family, each individual will have their own take in choosing the portraits and the style of their liking. Like these 3 Tripp siblings and cousins who they serve as a great example here. And the youngest of all, the Jacobus Tripp, opt for the lighter, more polished style of Van de Heerst. And he presented a new generation of patrons. They were at ease with their prosperity and demanded more glamour in their portraits. And this new generation we also had a new generation of painters who were prepared to serve them. And that includes several former pupils of Rembrandt, such as Ferdinand Bol. And that is why by the 1660s, when the Tripp brothers came to decorate their new houses, now is occupied by the Royal Academy, it was Bol who immortalized the brothers and celebrated the virtues of the 2 female relatives. And in this very highly competitive market, networking and social relations meant more than hosting parties than Van de Velkert once did. It asked the artists not only to create, to innovate, but also to please and to serve and to follow a certain social decorum in order to forge a strong tie. And for top-tier painters, they relied on such strong ties to get by. But that's only the top layer of the market and only the half of the story. And because for the middling and lower end market, that somehow still follow the business playbook, in which the weak ties still worked just fine. And this is why painters in St. Antonio Brestraat no longer spread out in the whole street, but more clustered. They were gathered around in the market. And that's also why the busy Kalverstraat has become a nice springboard for painters who just started or moved to Amsterdam. And even for a still life painter like Cornelis Brisset, the weak ties and the visibility can be translated into large commissions. After he moved next door to the Burgemeester, and he was started to get a lot more prominent, promising commissions, but such opportunities were too unstable to provide a livelihood. That's why after using such a few, after used up his opportunity with the public commissions, he actually took up a job as a keeper of the Amsterdam Theater Schouwburg in from the Keizergracht. But for low-life genre painter Peter Quast, Kalverstraat opened a door to his market success, and his work appeared in many inventories and several during his lifetime, whose location that I marked as the small houses on the Amsterdam map. And also, although he often painted some impoverished peasants or farmers or soldiers, he certainly himself did not die in poverty. His probate inventory suggests a comfortable life from a two-story house in which he worked in the upstairs room and perhaps showed his work in progress from the street-facing forehouse. But the most successful story from Kalverstraat may have been Karel de Jardin. He moved from one artistic cluster to another, and each relocation marked a stamp up in his rank as a painter. And when the city expanded again into its now famous half-moon shape, de Jardin was successful enough to buy properties in this newly developed area and to live in the Keizergracht among his patrons and clients. In 1670, he painted the portrait of now commonly identified as Jacob de Graaf, whose brother Peter de Graaf will be the focus of our second presentation by Chiara. And the period when Karel de Jardin was active saw the painters' population reached its peak, and a large number of painters formed three obvious clusters in the city, and each has a different specialty. But however, this triangular balance was very fragile, and it did not last for long. After 1670, when the newly expanded canal rings have drained the declining population of painters from the city center to decorate their new houses, the two centers that once active before, like Rozengracht and St. Antonio Brestraat, was now drained from his most prominent painters, and they were most of them were relocated to the Grand Canals in the newly development area. And like what happened in Antonio Brestraat before, the famous and the successful ones that was moved from the city center now afford to live in the Grand Canals, but their helpmates and pupils and assistants were squeezed in the back street. And Gerard de Larrey's probably the most successful painters of in the last decade of 17th century, who ran a large workshop in the city center, moved out after he went blind. But his many pupils, sooner or later, all moved to the same area to paint the ceilings and follow this different fashion and for the new houses. And by then, the art market had already fallen to its size and perhaps its simple structure as it was in the 1630s. So far, we have witnessed a full cycle of art market development. Although painters certainly did not make any location choices free of limitations or constraints, they still collectively voted with their feet by choosing the best place for their given condition. And by doing so, as I hope I have successfully demonstrated in this presentation, they adapted and shaped the development of the art market across the whole 17th century. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Xuan. That was very fascinating, a whole century of movement across town. I'd like to open the floor for questions briefly. Does anyone, you can either raise your hand or unmute yourself. Lia van Gemert, please.
Hi, good afternoon. Weixuan, as always, I loved your reading for us, your lecture. I think it was very informative, and you make great progress on your scheme. It seems almost that Amsterdam could do with the painters alone, if we see your immense map and mapping. But there are also those other groups, for instance, the publishers, for instance, the writers, for instance, the people who make the settings around the paintings. I know that Paul Dijsselbergen has an atlas like you, a map with all the publishers in Amsterdam, and I think it would be very interesting to lay them upon each other. And one of the reasons for being curious for that is that when you said the people who came from the south and they moved to surroundings of Jodenbreestraat, other people who came from the south, like the writers, moved to the Warmoesstraat, because that was also the street where the textile shops were. And I would be very interested to know whether there are interconnections between different groups. Do you have any idea of that already?
Yes, I think I can speak for the other merchants or other like those frame makers, but for the publishers and printers, I do have their spatial development over time too. And because today I only focused on the art market, so I didn't touch upon the publisher and the printers and the spatial evolution for that. But I think they developed in a more or less independently from the art market, and they have their own specialized area and they have their own preference for the location. And mostly in the beginning, they clustered around Dam Square and the Damrak. And then they somehow slightly spread to the other areas of the city, but more evenly, but mostly following the distribution of the shops, meaning that they were on the most traffic-heavy roads, that the radio streets and or close to the market, because they are relatively more. It's more of a shop than a like factory, in a sense, manufacturer, in a sense. So that's why they really rely on the passerbys and in the location that is easy to find by people who take read their books, and then they can follow the actual names that's printed on the book, basically to find the shops. So they have a slightly different approach because they are almost completely market oriented. But for the painter, there are three different kind of layers. And the top layer, which I focus mostly on today, is more prestige and relation-seeking ones that they serve and follow the top layer of the market of the patrons. And that's why we see this evolution of locations of these top painters move around the city. But for publishers, it's much less the case. And regarding the people who offer the art supplies, and unfortunately, we do not have enough data for that to have a relatively comprehensive overview of what they actually do. But I think from the scattered information that we have, they were very much accessible for painters, meaning that they were relatively close to where the painters were. in most cases.
And do you also have indications of the size of the houses?
I do for some of them. That's the second part of my dissertation. That look using inventories to suggest how big the painters and the art dealers' houses were, and most of them were in the typical two-story canal houses, the narrow, long one. That had some are slightly wider, but mostly are the standard size. So they definitely now occupy the luxury houses that we know now of those fancy canals.
Yes, I've seen previous presentations on that, and now I thought, hearing about the Jodendreestraat, could it be so that houses there were larger?
I think they probably compared to the small medieval houses that are in the middle of the city, but they certainly pale in comparison to the new houses developed in these newly developed areas like Herengracht and the Keizersgracht. But in the beginning of the 1610, when this firstly built, is probably the case.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you. I think we have time for one quick question, if anyone wants to raise one. Well, you covered a lot of ground, Xuan, also in your answering of Leah's question. So thank you very much. And we, of course, very much look forward to your dissertation. A few months more patience, I think. And yeah, good luck with the rest of the research. So from the bird's eye perspective on the art market, we now zoom into the level of one particular house, that of Pieter de Graaf, who had one of those very spacious houses built on the Herengracht. Chiara, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi everyone. So I'll share my screen. Can you enable share screen, please?
Yeah, it's done. Try it now.
Yes, perfect. Okay, do you see the...
Perfect.
Perfect, okay.
Thank you.
So what you see in this slide are two examples of the main sources that allows us to gain some insight in which books people owned and read in the early modern period, namely book auction catalogs and inventories. And here in particular, you can see an example of the book auction catalog of Jan VI and of Rembrandt's inventory, where some of his books are listed. There are, however, some problems with these sources. Establishing to what extent they are representative of the book collection owned by the person in question is particularly challenging. And in addition, they provide only a one-time snapshot of a book collection, usually at the end of a person's life, and often with unclear and untraceable dynamics leading to its creation. So when we use these sources, we're always confronted with questions such as, were all these books actually read by this person? Or, for example, were they inherited from somebody else and actually never touched? And what other books did this person own? Or again, in which occasion did they enter one's collection? Also, the evolution of taste and interest during a person's life is not detectable in these sources, as well as potential intruders in the case of book auction catalogs, included at the time of the auction by heirs or publishers eager to sell their stocks. The issue as to what extent they really represent a collection of the person in question limits their usability to establish firm conclusions about personal reading interest, unless we have other primary sources that allow us to double check and integrate the information that they contain. So what I'll be talking about in this presentation is one exceptional case in which abundant manuscript materials are available that provide ground to at least partially answer these questions. And indeed, this is the Library of Pieter de Graaf. De Graaf was a member of one of the most influential families at this time in Amsterdam. He was the eldest son of the Burgomeester Cornelis de Graaf and of Catharina Hooft. And the De Graaf and the Hooft were major players in the contemporary Dutch political arena. And they were connected often through intricate kinship relations to other renowned personalities of the political, intellectual, and artistic milieu of the time. De Graaf's wife was Jacoba Bicker, daughter of Jan Bicker, an affluent merchant and burgomeester. And through his wife, De Graaf was related also to the Grand Pensionary of Holland, Johan de Witt, who was married to Jacoba's sister, Wendela. De Graaf and de Witt were also friends to each other, as well as politically aligned. De Graaf graduated in canon and civil law at the University of Orléans and had a promising cursus honorum. He followed his father and his grandfather as chief administrator of the Dutch East India Company in the Amsterdam Chamber in 1664 and became a city officer in 1668. Due to his affiliation with de Witt, he was removed from his political appointments in 1672, but he will remain the windhebber of the VOC until his death. And we see him here in this portrait made around 1674 by Gerard ter Borch. And this portrait shows clear connections to his appointments. Not only we see the ships in the background, but also a large sea atlas on the table. And if you look closely, maybe you can see that it's opened at the sea chart depicting the Zuiderzee, a vital navigation route for the VOC trade. His book auction catalog is preserved and is kept at the National Library of Russia in St. Petersburg. The collection auctioned off under his name on 9 July 1709 contains more than 2,300 books and one represents the aspiration of a homo universalis whose library aimed to cover all aspects of knowledge. Several characteristics of this collection clearly point towards a learned humanistic library. Law, theology, and classics cover about 50% of the titles, and 64% of them is in Latin, followed by Dutch and French. Most of the books for which the year of publication is given in the catalog are dated before the half of the 17th century, and this is representative of the whole collection. In fact, this is also one of the characteristics that the books are said to have in the advertisement that appeared in the Oprechte Leidse Courant that you see in this slide, where de Graaf's books are advertised as many very rare, old, and well-conditioned. So we quickly went through some of the characteristics of the auction books, and now we come to the questions that I mentioned at the beginning. For example, were all these books actually owned by de Graaf? And if so, which ones did he actually read? Are there any that belonged to somebody else before ending up in his collection? And also, where did he keep them? As I said, in this case, there are several documents that shed light on this aspect. The first one is the draft of his family history, where de Graaf wrote about the lives of his father, his grandfathers, and some other relatives. It records their political appointments, contains transcriptions from the registers of his ancestors, but it also includes some details about their personalities, their interests, and their hobbies. So it's interesting to relate those to the books in the catalog. Then there are the notes in his VOC almanacs, which he kept for most of his life, and where he recorded business agreements, but also, for example, works in his house, milestones in the life of his children, illnesses, and interesting for this research, books that he bought or lent to somebody else. There are also 2 testaments that he and his wife made, which refers to specific locations in the house where books were kept. And also they say that the books were bequeathed to their eldest son, Cornelis. Next, there is his probate inventory that was drawn up upon his death, and that mentions a boekenkamer, a library in his house. And finally, a document that lists all the objects bequeathed to his son Cornelis, and none of them is listed in the inventory. So The combination of these pieces of information coming from these sources and more archival and library research has made it possible to identify the presence of a private library in the Graaf's house and pinpoint its location, identify other rooms in the house where books were kept, connect some books in the auction catalog to specific people and events. For example, it could relate books to his grandfathers, his father, his brother, and his sons, as well as to other of his relatives, such as Franz Panenko. And these sources were also useful to identify more objects and furniture that were in the library room and that have not been recorded in the inventory, and also to shed light on the afterlife of the Graaf's books, who inherited them and why they were auctioned off. And finally, to track down some of his books that were not sold at the auction. So in the next slides, I will show you a couple of examples. Let's start with the evidence of books that the Graaf used himself. In the catalog, there are several important Dutch historians, such as Christianus Cotanus, Peter Cornelis Hooft, who was, by the way, the Graaf's great uncle, Peter Christian Spoor, and Emanuel van Meteren. In the draft of his family history, the Graaf notes in margin several books of these and other historians with their precise folio numbering as references to find broader information about the events he is recounting. So we have the proof that these books were part of the materials that he consulted for his research on his family history. Let's see another example. Among the books under the header Medici et Philosophici, there is this treatise De Viribus Imaginationis, written by Thomas Vienus, who was a physician and professor of medicine at the University of Leuven in the late 16th and early 17th century. The book discusses the great power that imagination exerted over the body as both a potential cause and cure of diseases. And in the Graaf's almanacs, there is an entry that helps us to understand why this book was in his collection. It was on the 11th of January, 1678, when the Graaf noted down this title as a book that he should read. His wife Jacoba was sick, and that day she received the visit of the Jewish doctor Rocamora, who prescribed her some medicaments for her complaints. It was Rocamora who advised Peter to read this treatise. So we can suppose that in Rocamora's view, this book contains some useful information in relation to the cause and cure of Jacoba's illness. And this also shows how a book published several decades before was still in use at this time. The auction catalog contains, moreover, several books in Italian. There are 85 in total. Among them, there are the most famous Italian authors, which are commonly found in other libraries in the Dutch Republic. I've seen somebody, okay, somebody has to leave. So, for example, Dante's Commedia, the plays by Boccaccio, L'Orlando Furioso by Ariosto, and the Gerusalemme Liberata by Tasso. But several others are less known and very specific. For example, some travel guides, such as the La Guida dei Forestieri, a guide of Naples and surroundings written by Pompeo and Sarnelli, and Il Burattino Veridico, a successful pocket-sized itinerary written by Giuseppe Miselli. Both were published in the last decades of the 17th century, the first one in Naples and the second one, first in Rome and then in Venice. By digging into the Graaf's life, I can exclude that he ever went to Italy, but his brother, Jacob, that also Weixuan mentioned in her presentation, went there a few times. And the longest journey was between 1686 and 1688, where he took Peter's eldest son Cornelis with him, and they went to several cities, among which Venice, Rome, and Naples. As the years of the travel correlate with the dates of publication of both travel guides, we can safely assume that they were purchased by them to rely on updated information during this journey. And the Graaf almanacs offer further evidence to establish with certainty that he inherited his brother's books after Jacob died in 1690. There are several entries that walk us through what happened with them. On 7 June 1690, Peter records a visit of the bookseller Bohm, who proposed him to make a catalogue of his brother's books. Peter doesn't want to sell them, and a couple of weeks later, he will bring his brother's books at his house. As you can see from these entries, he will take a first batch of 291 books on 28 June, carried on 2 sledges, and a second one on the following day, this time again on 2 sledges. But as you can see, unfortunately, he left the space blank where he was supposed to write down a more specific overview of books by format. So if we assume a comparable number as the first day, or perhaps a bit more if the books were of smaller format, we can estimate that Peter brought home about 600 books, or maybe more, that previously belonged to his brother. Let's now turn to another aspect of the Graaf's book collection, namely the books that were not sold at the auction. Several of them are cumulatively mentioned in the list of the objects bequeathed to Cornelis. Some are mentioned in the Graaf's almanacs, and there are a few that I could track down that due to their particular value remained within the family. Among them, there is this presentation copy of Vondel's first Dutch translation of Virgil's poems that Vondel gave to Peter's father Cornelis in 1660. This gilt-edged book was bound in red velvet with red and blue ribbon ties, and their colors had been carefully chosen to match the hand-colored coat of arms of the Graaf, which was printed before the Parnaslov, an ode to Cornelis. The book stands out also for its size, a large quarto, and the thicker paper that was used in comparison to other copies. And at the end of the Parnaslov, we find Vondel's handwritten dedication to Cornelis. This attempt by Vondel to gain a structural formal patronage from the Graaf was not completely successful, but he received about 180 bottles of his favorite wine as a form of gratitude by Cornelis for this gesture. The last aspect that I'll quickly go through is the physical presence of books in the house that Peter and Jacoba lived in at Heregraaf, 573. Their testaments speak of books in the Boekenkamer, in een hekje, in the Kamerzolder, and in the Graaf's comptoir, his home office. They also give some spatial clues in relation to the position of the rooms within these rooms within the house. As you can see from my reconstruction, the Boekenkamer was the room above the forehouse with the same dimensions. The Kamerzolder was in the back of the house, just below the attic, and the comptoir 1 floor below, again in the back of the house overlooking the garden. For the Boekenkamer, there are several sources that supplement each other in providing a picture of what this room looked like. And in fact, this room changed so much that it's currently barely recognizable, even as an originally separate room. So as you can see in these pictures that it took a couple of years ago when the building hosted the Museum of Bags and Purses, parts of its walls have been demolished. And some plans and sections from 1974 have been a useful source to reconstruct the room in its original dimensions. And they also give away that, as we would expect, in fact, for this type of room, there were wooden beams on the ceiling, which have been hidden by later modifications. The inventory speaks only of the presence of an oak closet, a small iron chest, which has been crossed out, and 2 print boards. There is no reference of bookcases, which is understandable, as we know that usually fixed furniture pieces were not included in inventories. And again, it's a combination with other sources, which gives us more information about the presence and their look. In 1690, the Graaf records in his almanacs the plan to construct another bookcase for his son in the library, and it also gives the number of pieces of wood that would be needed, 2 longer and 6 shorter, with a thickness of a little more than 3 centimeters. And in the list of the objects bequeathed to Cornelis, we can learn about what kind of wood they were made of, Vurenhout. But this is not the only thing that we can learn from this document. In there, we also find a few curiosa. For example, as you can see in this image, different kinds of horns, some minerals, eggshells, and a turtle shell. So it's important to note that this document lists the objects that were recorded in the Boekenkamer, the comptoir, and the Kamerzolder all together. They are grouped by type and not by room, so this curiosa could have been in either of these rooms. But given what we know about private libraries and their common pairing with cabinets of curiosities, it's likely that these objects were in the library and not in the other rooms. So the Graaf's library would have then displayed some features of a sort of a Wunderkammer, and it would have created an ensemble with the medals and coin collection he had on display in 3 cabinets in the adjacent room, the Grand Salon. Based on these findings, I'm preparing an updated reconstruction of the preliminary version of this library that I made a while ago. And this 3D reconstruction will serve also as a tool to give an estimate of the available shelf space, and hence of how many books would fit in this room. In this way, it will be possible to establish whether this was the only house where the Graaf kept these books, or whether part of the auction books was stored somewhere else. In conclusion, some points to wrap up my talk. By looking at his book auction catalog alone, I would have had a very different idea about who the Graaf was as a book owner and reader. Also, the inventory gives an only partial image of the Boekenkamer, as this room contained, in fact, more objects than what was recorded in the inventory. This research, therefore, shows the importance of contextual primary sources to reconstruct a private library, both as a book collection and as a physical space. In this process, connections with specific people and events have emerged, which give meaning to the books in the catalog, clarify some of the dynamics through which this book collection was created, and shed light on its diachronic development. By digging into the lives of the Graaf and his relatives, I could establish relations between books and his grandfathers, his father, his brother, and his sons. So this shows that building up this book collection was not the result of a single collector, but a multi-generational endeavor. And for the Graaf was very much concerned with his family history and was the keeper of many documents belonging to his ancestors. I think the books he inherited must have also been a tangible memory of his relatives. And finally, I'd like to conclude with a word on the use of 3D reconstruction in historical research. In this case, it has been the creation of the 3D reconstruction of the library as a physical space that prompted this research on reconstructing the book collection to understand what was the content of this room and how much it could contain. So I think it's important to look at 3D reconstructions not only as a way to visualize knowledge that has been already acquired, but also as research tools that are actually they're actual driving forces guiding the data collection phase. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Chiara. I think not only a driving force behind the data collection, but also raising new questions about this library. And your research on this you're currently turning it into a book publication for Brill. So it's proven a very rich resource. So that's really, really nice. I'd like to open the floor again to questions from the audience. Who would like to start? Leah, yes, please.
Well, again, I enjoyed it very much, Chiara. Thank you.
Thank you.
I take it that you have contact with the project at the Radboud University by Alicia Montoya?
Mediate? The mediate?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
because they are dealing with the same subject and then the 18th century catalogs.
Mm-hmm.
And they have been working quite a few years now, but as far as I know, they don't have the last element you had, and which I think is a great jump forward in measuring the books physically. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, was that possible to do with all the items you found?
No, not with all the items. So what I did was to actually take the measurements in the Tiziana library, and to try to to estimate how many books of a certain format would fit within the shelves at the Tiziana, and see then apply to the shelf space available in my reconstruction of the Buchenkammer to see then how many books would fit in there. So yeah, I think, I mean, it would be great to be able to do it with every book, but yeah, it's just a time consuming process. It's like more than 2,000 books, so it will be certainly impossible. So the calculation that I have so far points toward the fact that I think half of the collection that it's in the book catalog would actually fit in the Buchenkammer. So then the question is, okay, where else were the other books stored? And I think, yeah, as I showed in the testaments, there are other locations like the comptoir and this space in the Kammerzolder. But yeah, maybe there were also other places where these books, other houses where these books were kept as well.
Yes, and the extra chest they had made for the what you call the zolder, the upper room. Could you measure from that chest which kind of books would fit into it?
No, I'm not at that level. No, and the thing of the Kammerzolder in the inventory, they speak about two parts. So there is an eerste gedeelte and the tweede gedeelte. And in the testaments and also in the almanacs, Peter de Graaf speaks about this hekje. So it's not completely clear to me how much space actually in the Buchenkammer could have been reserved for books. And there is also actually another almanacs entry where they say that they are going to construct another bookcase in the Kammerzolder. So that space, I think, because the comptoir is actually quite small, so I wouldn't expect to be able to fit a lot of books over there. But yeah, maybe the Kammerzolder was actually the room where the rest of the books were there. And of course, it might have been also that in other locations, in other rooms where, as you said, chests where books were just put in. And I have in the inventory, in fact, quite a few chests with no content, because usually when there is some, for example, textiles or other blankets or other type of this materials, they are all recorded, but for some of the chests there is no content recorded, so they might have been used for books as well, in fact.
Yes. Last question: did you use the SCCN to find out the size of books?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, and actually in the catalog already the books are organized by format. So
okay, as usual.
Yes, exactly. So the format is not really the problem. I think the thickness is more the problem. See how thick they are, and of course here there are variation. I mean, you could expect a range, a reasonable range for format, but yeah, some of them are very small, even being like a folio format, and some of them are more thicker, even for a duodecimo, for example. So yeah, so estimate the thickness. That's where. So, I mean, also the estimate that I'm making, it's more, as a sort of tool to think about, okay, where there are other rooms is not that I'm presenting hard truth for how many books would fit in this room.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Giovanni, please.
Thank you very much, Chiara, but I'm
I don't hear you, Giovanni.
No, you accidentally.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry. No, I was just saying that I'm happy to yield my time to Dirk, because I'm speaking later on. I don't think we have time for 2 questions.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Giovanni. I have a small question. That is, how lucky are you to have these 2 sources? I mean, how current is it to have both a sales catalog and a probate inventory? I regularly look into sales catalogs to see if people own the books they mention in their letters, but I've never come to my I never thought of actually checking whether there's a probate inventory to see all this contextual information. So, you know, how unique is this? And are we, as book historians, should we actually more critically or more, you know, systematically look for these inventories?
Yeah, I think so, actually, because in this case, well, it's not just the product inventory, but there are also all these other documents in the De Graaf family archive, which, yeah, when I saw that actually this project, I have to tell you, this project was meant to be much smaller at the beginning, so just a reconstruction of the room. But then when confronted with all this material, then I thought, okay, this is really exceptional. And to be able to get all these different pieces of information and integrate them, I think is really great. And in fact, it could serve also as as a memento also for everyone working with these sources. Always, in fact, look critically at the fact that they might not represent completely a collection. And also, in fact, as you said, maybe go to the archives and see if there is any kind of documentation available. And was also interesting in this case was to try to, and that I had the help of our junior researcher, former junior researcher, Bart Reuvenkamp, to try to find out the inheritance, because what came out from this work that we did was that Peter de Graaf actually inherited from a lot of his relatives, also distant relatives. So at a certain point in his life, he really collected a lot of paintings, but also, I imagine, books. And I think this really reflects in what I see in the catalog.
I think it nicely shows how something where you start off with a 3D modeling task or idea, that this becomes this whole, well, this project, but also the object, the house itself, becomes a kind of microcosm for a lot of histories. So it's really nice, I think, showing how 3D as a research tool can really put you on track of sources that you never thought about in the first place. So very nice. Giovanni, then I think if you want, take the freedom to ask your question to Chiara. But if not, then please, I'd like to give you the floor to share with us your research on crypto art, which of course is really topical for and characterizing or starting to characterize our 21st century cultural industries. Please, the floor.
Very much so. Thank you very much. Well, I'll ask Chiara another time, because actually my question was very close to Dirk's one. So all good. So thank you very much for the invitation. That definitely we are going to do a much more significant jump here in time and content than previous two presentations. I'm going to tell you a little bit about crypto art, a relatively recent trend in digital art. So I'm going to touch upon the following three topics. First of all, what is crypto art, or non-fungible tokens used to exchange artworks? Secondly, mention a few examples of applications of non-fungible tokens for art. And then mention early results from a project that we have at UvA on understanding a little bit more who is part of this community. Now, first point, what is crypto art? Of course, we need to start with blockchains, because this is really the defining element, I would say, much more than a uniform artistic movement in terms of aesthetics, for example, or in terms of the points that they want to make. This is about using a certain technology to exchange artworks. So blockchain is really important. What is blockchain? The most famous example is Bitcoin. And the goal of Bitcoin is to allow anyone to exchange a currency, Bitcoins, and do so using a peer-to-peer network. So without having a centralized authority, such as a bank, for example. And therefore, to do this, what you need to have is a ledger, so a list of transactions, which is distributed, it's not centralized. And it stores, this ledger, the blockchain, stores transactions using cryptography in a secure way. On top of it, though, you also need another extremely important component, which is a consensus-making protocol. So a mechanism that allows everybody, part of the network, to agree when a transaction is legit or not. And this is achieved in Bitcoin using what is called proof of work. I won't go into the details, but there is this very important motivation for it to be there. Now, Bitcoin allows you only, or the blockchain Bitcoin allows you only to exchange Bitcoins. So you can send Bitcoins and receive Bitcoins, and that's about it. But people soon figured out that you can do much more on a blockchain, and you can store much more complicated things coming essentially from a programmable agent. And this is how smart contracts were born, and in particular Ethereum, which is another blockchain. So the idea here is to complexify the space of possible transactions that end up being stored on a blockchain, in particular to make them programmable. So imagine having scripts that allow people to do different things, and everything that they do becomes a transaction that is stored on the blockchain, following similar principles to what I mentioned before for Bitcoin. So this is the technology underpinning crypto art. So what is crypto art? Definition that we could use is that crypto art is limited edition digital art, cryptographically registered with a token on a blockchain. So these tokens are kind of certificates that are associated with a piece of art, a piece of digital art most often, or digitized art as well. And what they do is that they offer a transparent and auditable origin for the artwork. And also they keep track of provenance. So every time that the non-fungible token associated with an artwork is exchanged, we have that transaction on the blockchain. And the blockchain is open and public, so everybody can go and check. So this is what crypto art is. It seems complicated, but actually it's not, right? So it's a kind of certificate of authenticity associated with a digital artwork. And then everything that happens to it, so the certificate, not the artwork, is registered on the blockchain. Now, let's imagine the following scenario, right? So we have an art gallery in the real world. And an art gallery in the real world does a set of activities. For example, if you're an artist, you can go and ask the gallery to exhibit your art, and then hopefully you might do some sales. A gallery also has some form of pricing associated with each artwork, public or more often not public. You can go in a gallery and then have a negotiation to buy an artwork. The gallery can make a sale or can make a transfer, for example, not even for money, etc., etc. Right? So these are the kind of things that you can do as a gallery. Now, what happens with crypto art is that these actions are embedded into a so-called smart contract. So they become pieces of code that can be activated to do pretty much the same thing. So here is the same scenario, the same actions, but in a crypto art gallery. So instead of bringing in an artwork, you mint an artwork. What does it mean? When people say you tokenize it, it means that you create a new token that you associate with the artwork. And then the token is what gets transacted, exchanged, and the like. Similarly, you can fix prices, you can run auctions, you can receive offers, etc., etc. So everything is the same, but it's done through a piece of code. So that's a bit the idea. Let me show you quickly an example. So this is an artwork that was minted in 2018. You can see there at the bottom. It has become pretty famous. Also, the artist has become pretty famous. He's called Xcopy. And it was originally sold for a very small amount of money, and then it made the news a few months ago because it sold for a few million dollars. Now, the interesting thing that I'm going to show you is that last transaction is just an example. For 1,000 Ether, which is the currency of Ethereum, more or less worth $3 million, a bit less now, but you know, it goes up and down. If you go into the gallery in this case is called Super Rare, is one of the main galleries in crypto art. You're able to see essentially the artwork, which is a GIF in this case. So it's an animated file. And you will be able also to see all the history of transactions associated with its token, including the original artist and the current owner, in this case, an anonymous address. But what is really interesting, just as an example of what gets stored into the blockchain, is that everything that happens to the token gets recorded. It's absolutely transparent. For example, I mentioned at the beginning that the latest sale for this artwork was for 1,000 Ether. Now you can go on the blockchain and check exactly which smart contract identified by an address was responsible for routing, for taking up that transaction and routing all the ETHs around, and also what happened, where the money went, essentially. So this is both an example of how transparent all the data becomes in crypto art, but also the fact that you can do a lot of things that are new using smart contracts. The example here is the payment of an artist royalty on a resale of an artwork, which automatically gets paid to the artist. In this case, 10% of the resale value goes to the original artist. This is something that, you know, it has been decided by Super Rare. Different galleries have different rules, but it's an example of the programmability that you can have in crypto art. I mean, there are no such thing as royalties to artists on resales in the traditional art market that I know of. So it's quite an interesting innovation. For those of you that know the art market, the physical one, you will also see that here we have a 3% fee for the gallery on a resale. Now, to give a comparison, on average, galleries can take up from 30 to 70% of a sale in the primary market, and auction houses can go from 10 to 20% on resales. I'm talking about Sotheby's and Christie's and the like. So dramatically lower transaction costs. Now, all this transparency brings a few interesting properties to crypto art that are being explored. One is that provenance is, in a sense, perfect, because from the moment when you create an NFT and you associate it with your artwork, then everything that happens to it is absolutely open and everybody can go and check. The second thing is that crypto art is always visible, is always on display. There's no such thing as, you know, buying it and putting it in your living room. It's always there for everybody to see. But still, also ownership is very clear, right? So it's a very interesting novelty, because ownership doesn't entail taking out of public visibility an artwork, but actually it's always there, including who is the owner. So it's a different way to get social reputation for owning something, if you like. At the same time, there are also, let's say, complicated issues. For example, copyright and legal rights in general are absolutely unclear, because technically what you buy and sell is a token, it's not the artwork. And no one really prevents the original artist or anyone for that matter to tokenize it again. And this is actually a big problem at the moment. There is also another thing which is related to what I mentioned, so the artist royalties, which I think is very, very interesting. This is just but one example of really what you can think with you can do with smart contracts. In principle, you can do whatever you like, right? So they are completely programmable. So many different market logics are emerging that are based on different incentives. They try to do different things, right? So, for example, provide for a more sustainable business model, in particular for artists. A final point is that the cultural apparatus of traditional art is at the moment largely missing, even though, you know, a lot of players are jumping in. And that has interesting consequences, right? Because, for example, there is no really well-established criterion for quality, right? So a lot of things go, and I would say that the market has a much more important role in determining success than everything else considered. So these are just a few things that that I think are quite interesting, make crypto art interesting. Now, to come just quickly back to the point of non-fungible tokens, because this is, you know, the buzzword that maybe you also have heard about. What is the relationship between non-fungible tokens and crypto art? Well, non-fungible tokens are pretty much anything that is registered on a blockchain. Right? So it's a technology that allows you to also create crypto art. So crypto art uses non-fungible tokens. At the same time, non-fungible tokens are used for many more asset categories, collectibles more generally, but also other things. Okay, so few examples of what is happening or has happened in crypto art that I think is interesting. It's just a gallery, you know, a high selection bias from myself. The first thing is that what brought to public attention crypto art have been big sales. In particular, this one from previously relatively unknown designer and artist, Beeple, that sold a collage of work from him at Christie's back in March for a really significant amount of money. And that served the purpose to put crypto art and non-fungible tokens on the radar, so to say, and also foster really a gold rush from many players and artists into the space. I wouldn't say, though, that its artistic merit are particularly significant, but it's a kind of a milestone in the history of the space. More interesting from an artistic point of view, I think, is generative art, in particular the gallery art blocks that I really encourage you to go and take a look at. Because here the encounter of, let's say, computation and blockchains and you know, the digital space really comes in full force. The idea of generative art is that the art is generated through a script given a set of inputs. So given a set of inputs, you have deterministically, you're able to recreate the artwork. And everything that is stored on the blockchain, both the script, the inputs, and transactions that happen associated with the artwork. So this is a nice example, I think, of using blockchains for generative art, which is, by the way, something that is much older, of course, that exists since decades. But here is finding new life, so to say. Third thing to mention are marketplaces, such as OpenSea, where you can go and find many forms of different non-fungible tokens, including art, but really also other quite different things, collectibles, social tokens, and the like. OpenSea is the main example. There are others coming up. I think it's an interesting way to kind of go and check what is happening. And there is a lot of variety. So it can be stimulating. It can be also be a bit overwhelming, but I think worth checking out. And then finally, maybe a little bit closer to what we do, it's worth noting also that many museums have been experimenting with non-fungible tokens and or are thinking about using non-fungible tokens. Sometimes just as a way to monetize, for example, to create gadgets or things that they can sell, but other times for a little bit maybe more interesting goals. And this is really just starting, just beginning. So we might see more about it in the near future. Maybe another point worth mentioning is the trends in the market. Right? So the market is very bumpy. I mean, like it's always the case in crypto, but particularly for NFTs and crypto art. So at the moment, it has really followed a kind of pattern of waves, also with different trends. You can see an example here. for example, last summer in 2021 really was big moment for generative art. Then we had other ups and downs. And it's quite funny because so the first time that I started to talk about crypto art, we were here, and of course I could zoom in, and it was still a bump in a sense, but now we have moved ahead quite a bit. So this, I think, is interesting because the size of the market has become very substantial in such a way that I hope we will see more interesting applications and potentially maybe also reduction of noise eventually. And the final thing that I want to mention is our early results from a project that we have at UVA, which is titled Global Digital Art, Perspectives on Categories, Place and Economic Value in the Crypto Art Market, together with Andrea Leiter from the Law School and Monika Kakovic from the Business School. This is thanks to a grant from the Global Digital Cultures priority area. And as part of this project, we have run a survey, quite the first survey on the crypto art community last summer. And it was a pretty detailed survey. So we were quite happy to have a couple of hundred responses. And I'm just going to highlight a few things from it. We are working on a publication based on its results. Well, the main take-home message I would say is that there isn't much difference between crypto art and a traditional art space. So most of the users and artists, they are from the Western world, in their 30s and 40s, so a lot of millennials and Xers. The gender distribution is the same, skewed towards males. And what we found interesting is that many artists underline the interest in collaborations and in like creating communities supported by a market, but in view of making new forms of art. But at the same time, really consistently, the artists underline how important it was to them to have a go-to-market, which was, with much lower barriers than the traditional art market, and also with more sustainable models, including the royalties that I mentioned. Right? So this is something that pretty much everyone underlines as something very, very important, right? So to counteract a bit the instability of the career as an artist. Another interesting thing is that we found out that most people came from the creative industries, and also a good share from IT and information technology, a relatively few from the art market trade. Why creative industry is interesting? Because this is the trend that is developing at the moment, right? So collectibles, art were the beginning. Now NFTs are expanding to other areas. Music, photography, and gaming are in particular now really growing very rapidly. So I think this is something that might really expand rapidly to very broadly to the creative industries at large. Okay, there is much more, but I'm happy to share the website if you like. To conclude, I would say 3 take-home messages. One is that crypto art is a category in NFTs or uses NFTs, so it can go under that umbrella. NFTs are much broader, so it's really a technology that allows you to tokenize something on the blockchain, to give something an identity on the blockchain and then do stuff with that identity. Second, I really haven't too much mentioned the dark side of NFTs, but it's really a big issue and a big concern. Speculation is one aspect, but also really illegal or unwanted practices such as wash trading and other things. And then thirdly, I think with respect to crypto art in particular, the big question at the moment is whether crypto art will emerge as an alternative art market, as a way to support alternative avenues to go to the market for artists, or it will become a category in the contemporary art market. And traditional players will have enough space in there to essentially make it so. This is still largely unknown, so we shall see what happens. That will be all. I hope I haven't, told you too many diverse and strange news, and it was somewhat coherent, but I'm happy to answer any question you might have.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. Super exciting. I have tons of questions, but before we go to that, maybe someone else would like to ask a question first. Nana, please go ahead.
Hi, Giovanni. Great overview of what's going on in this space.
Hey, Nana, thanks.
To what extent is crypto art actually about the art? So there's digital art in general, which has been around before it and seems to sort of now kind of been drawn towards this as, I guess, a way of monetization. But in what sense does crypto art influence what kind of art is being made, or does it not actually influence it? So in what sense are these things intertwined, and in what sense is it just a market for trading?
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, well, I would say there are 2 points broadly to be made here. One is that at the moment, crypto art is, I would say, primarily about providing access to a new market for artworks. Even though that should be nuanced by the fact that there are parts of the broad crypto art space where really artistic innovation is happening. For example, generative art that I mentioned. And I think that's a connection with the other point. So I would say that crypto art is essentially a form of digital art, right? So you need to engage with certain media that you can create with, and especially you can experience in a digital setting. At the moment, the setting is pretty limited, right? So all the jokes about JPEGs and GIFs, it's actually true, right? I mean, what can you do as an artist with a JPEG? I mean, many things, I suppose, but probably not everything, right, that you would like to. So many of these artworks, they have been, and they still are, recordings of forms of art that happen in another space, right? So for example, performances that are adapted to become recording and then be exchanged. And in that respect, I think the go-to-market aspect is the more important one. But there are then other forms of art that are more digitally native, or for which there are spaces of engagement that are being built, such as virtual worlds, where the artistic component can shine much more, right? Because it's more attuned to the means that you have at hand. So I don't know to what extent that answers the question, but I think there is a bit of both, and there are trends developing in both directions.
I see. Thank you. Very interesting. I think that's because of its transparency, it's an interesting ecosphere to study, just because of like you can trace all the behaviors and things going on. So I think
for sure,
it's already interesting.
Yeah, for us, people playing with data is amazing. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Helene, please go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry, just sliding. I have some questions, and you can choose which ones to answer concerning ownership. I'm quite new to this. So I was wondering, you say it's possible for an artist, for example, to release new versions, and that can be a problem if the first version, if I say correctly, is already out. But I also wondering, how does it work for museums like Metropolitan Rijksmuseum putting their images in the public domain? What if you have, if it's a classical artwork, a different photo or kind of different digital image? Is that then a different version if you would make NFTs of it? And what if I would like to do that with artwork that I have at home, can I photograph it and make an NFT of it, or does it depend on how long the maker is already gone? Well, things like that I find intriguing. So choose which ones you like to answer.
Yes. Yeah, well, I mean, most of it, it's really unclear. That's the issue. So at the end of the day, there are no really legal rights out of this. Right? I mean, you buy a token, you buy an NFT, you essentially have no rights on anything coming from the artist. What you're buying, I would say, is a social contract between you, the artist, and everyone else. That's the kind of original, and everybody buys into this story. But legally speaking, I mean, I'm no expert, but there are no grounds whatsoever for which you can, for example, exercise rights that would be normal in other setting. Like, for example, I don't know, take down that artwork that I have bought the NFT for from a virtual exhibition. You cannot do it, right? I mean, it's you can definitely take a picture and tokenize the picture of an artwork that you have at home. Other people can tokenize artwork from other artists. The same artist can tokenize their own artworks in principle. Now, in practice, though, this sometimes happens, especially in marketplaces such as OpenSea, where there are much fewer controls. It's a big issue, right? So there are a lot of, let's say, tokenized things that should not have been tokenized by those people, let's put it this way. And it's very difficult to enforce anything. Actually, OpenSea has tried and failed recently in the past days. But regulations and controls are much stronger in specific galleries. So it matters a lot where you tokenize and where you buy your stuff and from whom you buy it. So the social layer, to the extent that it's possible, is taking care of that. But there are so many unknowns, and there are no regulations at the moment. So this is also why, I mean, people people doing research on law and regulations are really interested in this, and we have very interesting projects at UVA as well about it. So pay attention what you do, essentially. That would be the recommendation, but it's really the Wild West.
Yeah, and that's also very interesting. That is so lots of people experiment with it, both artistically and commercially or legally. Yeah. I see two more hands. Fabian, please.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. So I also have lots of questions or thoughts that come with this, probably also due to the fact that I don't really know anything about it, but it's I think there's like so many problems, although it's super fascinating at the same time, right? Like if there's not even control about who really it poses question like, what is art, right? I could upload the same file 50 million times and give it a different token number. Is that then the same artwork? So like more a philosophical question about identity. And then another thought was like, what happens actually if something like an illegal image which exists on the internet is declared as an NTF, right? Is there any possibility that like law enforcement could actually do something to take these things down or so? Because this could also be a way kind of to define things as art that are clearly not.
Yeah.
And yeah, you know what I'm getting at, right? So do you have maybe a comment on these issues?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing I'd like to say though is that, to be very honest, it's not that a traditional art market is like super transparent and clear about all this, right? There are so many forgeries around, and there is a very strong component of like stories, right? So there are layers of credibility that are added to artworks that influence the price and influence also, you know, the trustworthiness of its originality, for example. But oftentimes they also have shaky foundations as well. So I would say that the NFTs don't solve that. But at the same time, they make these problems quite explicit data-wise, right? Because at least the stuff is there, the data is there, the transactions are there. So I don't know about law enforcement. I think it's going to be complicated for them to do anything. But what I think at the moment is emerging, and I think it's a suboptimal solution, is that it's a centralized approach, right? So it's the marketplace or it's the gallery that is more or less taking care, more or less well, of this problem by, for example, screening people that have that can mint using a certain contract in a gallery, or doing checks. And if there is a report, they might take down an NFT because it contains materials coming from another artist and the like. But it's a centralized solution to a decentralized ecosystem. So this is why I think it's a bit problematic, but very open question. Illegal images, it's really the same, right? So you will find galleries and marketplaces that won't allow you or will do checks on that. And those are usually the most reputed, where the biggest transactions take place. And you will find places that are just Silk Road of NFTs, so to say.
Like you said, the Wild West.
Oh, yeah, that's another way to put it. Yes.
Okay. We have time for one more question, I think, Harm.
Yes, Giovanni, thank you for your clear presentation.
Thank you.
I was wondering, when you did your survey, did you also investigate things like ideology? Because a large part of the Bitcoin market is driven by ideology. It's a kind of the spiritual heirs of Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises are doing SimCity with actually a perfect market. I believe is an ideological goal. Well, markets aren't perfect in the real world, but we can create them online. And then all those philosophies of von Hayek and von Mises will come true.
Yes, yeah. That's a very good point. So we didn't, unfortunately. The survey was already too long. But I very much agree that this is an interesting aspect that I hope to follow up on in a follow-up with a broader set of questions. Although I would also say that, so that's definitely the case, but there are also many different philosophies that come into blockchains, different souls and different spirits. And one that is also in is the goal of inclusivity and the goal of sustainability of the art market. So there are quite several communities that really work towards using NFTs and blockchains to provide for that. And that is a very, very different kind of philosophical entry point from the one that you mentioned. So I think it's broadening up. But I don't have a survey to base this statement on. So it's definitely future work. By the way, Julia, if I may add one thing. So I'm very interested in collaborations on this. We are collecting data and thinking about next steps and the like. So if any of you would like to follow up on a coffee and discuss, I'm very happy to.
So, well, you will know Giovanni for collaboration. I think it's super fascinating. In Rotterdam on the diet of looking at social kits. So I'm super fascinated from that perspective of how ideas on authenticity are sort of playing out in this domain, in this emerging market. So I think there's a lot of angles for interesting work to come. So thank you very much, Giovanni, for sharing with you, and no doubt we'll invite you back when you have more results in the future.
Thank you. A pleasure.
And the same, of course, goes for Chiara and upcoming publication was mentioned in the chat. We have our reading homework coming up as well. And And to the rest of you, thank you again for joining us virtually. I really hope that at some point we'll go back to it again. But I myself am in quarantine this week, so yeah, it's just we're still in this stage. But I really look to seeing you again, hopefully next time in real life. And our next salon will be on music and musical performances, and that will take place on March 3rd via our regular channels. So hope to see you soon, and have a good day. And
thank you. Bye-bye.
thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.